Good morning, folks. This is Instructor Gaynor here. Today we're going to be doing some of the highlights from the introductory chapter in the textbook, Logic in Contemporary Rhetoric. Some of this we already talked about a little bit in a very brief lecture on our first day. But I do want to hit those again in some detail, as well as much as we can get to of the main themes of chapter 1, which is the introductory chapter. Now, the first bullet point I have here is what is reasoning? And we will be doing reasoning all throughout the semester. Reasoning is one of those things I will not ask you for some kind of banal definition of. In general, we reason all the time. Probably it's second nature and we don't think about it very much. Reason, rationality, it is something that we are capable of. To think things through, to think in structural ways. That is, to have information and then to learn how to draw conclusions that can be drawn from the information given. Now, we're going to be talking about two basic kinds of reasoning very shortly. Now, we already talked about what an argument is, so I will run through it very quickly. In this course, and by the way, as what we call the real world, people transact in arguments. We make arguments either to try to persuade others to hold a particular position, in some cases to try to determine what positions we ought to hold. Now, an argument will consist of although this is usually put at the end, it will consist of a conclusion. You want to call it the thesis of the argument, that's fine too. This is the position that we are trying to support. So an argument will have a conclusion and it will have supporting reasons. And the word that you ought to put in your data banks for these supporting reasons is the supporting reasons are called premises. Now, one of the first activities that we'll be doing in this course, homework-wise and practice problems, will be looking at short passages, and you will be asked, is there in fact an argument here at all? So identifying if we have an argument. Now, if indeed we have an argument, you ought to be able to identify what the conclusion is, as well as what the supporting reasons are. And for our purposes, if either of these components are not either explicitly present or implicitly present, then you don't have an argument. If neither of these components are explicitly present nor implicitly, the reason I wanted to highlight this right now is because in everyday language and everyday language arguments, occasionally, an arguer might actually omit one of the premises. In some cases, they may actually omit the conclusion in their argument. Take a guess what they'll take for granted. My audience isn't stupid. My audience sees the premises I have put out, and I'm pretty sure that they will implicitly get to my intended conclusion. Now, typically, folks, this is not good form in formal argumentation. As a matter of fact, in formal argumentation, you should probably be explicit about. In other words, don't assume that your readers or listeners will be able to connect the dots. Pardon the cliche there. Don't assume that they'll be able to connect the dots. Now, admittedly, in some of the practice problems, I don't remember if they're ones that I officially assigned to turn in, but there will be some that will have unstated but implied premises. I would still call that an argument, but I would call it put together in a shoddy fashion. Conclusion, supporting reasons. Next. I've kind of already segued into point 3. Let me read it. You ought to have the ability to identify if there's an argument present in a given passage, identify the premises, or premise in some cases, and the conclusion, and you ought to keep aware when you're doing this of indicator words. Now, admittedly, I think the textbook kind of breezes through this a little bit quickly. It might be under the assumption that some of you are familiar with this, because this is an exercise you may have done somewhere else along the line. Take a short passage, determine what the conclusion is, determine what the premises are. Well, one of the ways of doing so, if it's not readily apparent, is to see if there are indicator words within the passage that would suggest what's likely the conclusion, what is likely the premise, or what are premises. Some common conclusion indicator words are things like therefore, it follows that, in conclusion, so. Now, this is not an all-encompassing list. This is a short list of common conclusion indicator words. Common premise indicator words. I'll give you the two easy ones. Because and since are the most common premise indicator words. Now, folks, very frequently, and you've probably heard this before, so I apologize if I'm stating the obvious or something that you're already familiar with. Sometimes indicator words will not be present at all, even though it is an argument. This is why practice comes in. Practice at reading arguments so you can learn to read. Let me erase. Reading the piece and taking context cues to suggest to you what is likely the conclusion and what is likely the premise. And when we're looking at some specific examples very shortly, I will go through my procedure for doing some of these. And granted, this might actually be a little too laborious in some cases. But if I'm not sure whether, what the structure of the argument is, I will ask myself if I am capable of restating it in my own words. And if I restate it in my own words, sometimes that leads me to what the structure of the argument is. so I can more clearly determine, yeah, this is the conclusion we're trying to get to. And yeah, this is one of the supporting premises. Now, I've stated a little bit differently, but nonetheless, I have captured the meaning, and I've also done a good job of trying to show how it connects with the conclusion. Now, thank you. Now, two words I didn't cover that you'll want to have in your data banks pretty much right away, because they will follow us through the course. The author introduces the phrase cogent or cogency versus fallacy or fallacious. Now, folks, cogency is a word that is generally used to refer to an argument that is a well-formulated argument. Now, I will talk more in a minute about the criteria met by a well-formulated argument. But if an argument is well-formulated and it meets all of the criteria of an argument, of a cogent argument, a rational person ought to say, yes, I accept this argument. Now, by the way, cogency is a pretty high standard. I'll just let you know that right here. There's more ways to get an argument wrong than there are to get an argument right. So yeah, we will talk in a moment about the author's rendition of the criteria met by a cogent argument. Fallacious. A fallacious argument refers to an argument that commits fallacious arguments commit some kind of argumentative error. Moving forward, we will be talking about the various ways that an argument can go wrong. And I'll actually be giving an example very shortly here. Actually, maybe I should give it right now. How many of you folks watch the news? Good. It's not required. I will tell you this. When I hear arguments, or even when I have information given, I don't know if it's a personality thing or just the fact that I've been schooled in this kind of stuff. I have difficulty not hearing an argument without trying to pick it apart. That is, to figure out if some kind of error has been made. My wife likes to turn on News 8 in the morning. That's, I guess, the local channel based out of the Lancaster area. One of the people who read the news, gave this fabulous statistics, and I'll give you almost a verbatim quote. And this has to do with legitimate statistics, by the way. He says, now you have more chance of dying of a drug addiction than you do of dying in a car crash. I imagine some of you probably heard that in the news. Now, immediately, I was ready to tear my hair out. Because even though the statistic is in fact what? Yeah, it is in fact a believable statistic. The conclusion that I was suggested to draw was completely off. Now, the key word, he says, you have more chance of dying of a drug addiction than you do of dying in a car crash. Even though the statistic is true, and I think it's probably believable, and I'll give it to you, because I looked it up. and several reliable sources had it. You have a 1 in 96 chance of dying of something related to opioid addiction. And it was a 1 in 103 chance of dying in a car crash. Folks, this is probably reliable data. In other words, the premise that he put out was in fact true. But the conclusion that I was begged to draw from it was clearly off. Because he said, these statistics are generalizations. Why do you think I would say I do not have a greater chance of dying of opioid-related complications versus dying in a car crash? I'm even afraid to go to the darn doctor, let alone take pain medication, even if I needed to do it. So my odds of even taking opioids in the first place are obviously low. So yeah, even if these general statistics are true, I shouldn't draw the conclusion that I have more likelihood dying. Same way if you heard stuff about likelihood of dying in a plane crash versus in a car crash. Well, guess what? If you never get in airplanes, your individual odds are astronomically low. Yeah, an airplane could hit your house or something like that. But the odds of that happening are what? Very, very low. Now, this is actually, I'm highlighting a fallacious argument we'll actually see in a later chapter. It is what the author will call a questionable use of good statistics. The statistics are likely reliable, but the conclusion that we're asked to infer from the statistics turns out to be a questionable conclusion. And indeed, if you're not used to picking things like this apart, these kind of things slip past a lot of people. If you're not used to picking these things apart. And I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but perhaps the fact that a lot of people consume information passively might be a reason why we might not delve into arguments like this. I just wanted to give you an example here of a fallacious argument. Now notice the premises were statistics that were likely reliable. So we had true premises, but the conclusion that we were drawing turned out to be questionable. Why? Because there's more to a good argument than just having facts. In other words, the facts that we are presenting need to relevantly relate to the conclusion that we're trying to draw. In this case, the statistics were likely correct. It's just that the conclusion that was being drawn was problematic. And you'll probably know a lot of times errors of reasoning will be very easy to point out. Other times they might be a little more subtle. The good news, and I hope you think this is good news, you're going to see a lot of examples moving forward. You're going to also get a fair amount of practice. So if it's not second nature to you to do this kind of thing already, hopefully it will catch on. Next. We already talked about this in our first lecture a little bit. The concept of validity. Now, I'm going to make some distinctions that are not made clear in the chapter. And I made this sort of in the very short introductory lecture. Folks, validity is a word that we use to refer to an argument that is structurally well formulated. So when we speak of an argument being valid, we are not talking about this. Validity is not an issue of the truth value of the premises. Validity is a measure of whether or not the structure of the argument is logical or not. And if you don't like this word structure, I hope you do. Another synonymous word might be the form of the argument, the way the thing is put together. Perhaps I should give you an easy example. If the government shutdown continues going on, we'll say G for government shutdown. If the government shutdown continues to go on, then the economy will likely suffer. But we can't have the economy suffer. Therefore, we can't let the government shutdown go on for much longer. Now, folks, you'll notice that I had these big linguistic chunks, and I merely represented them as letters. Well, guess what? When we're putting together what we will be calling deductive arguments, this is not only something that's perfectly legitimate, this is actually something that you're probably better off doing. Because this way we can more easily see the way the argument is. We can more easily see the way that the argument is structured. And if we can see the way the argument is structured, then we can see if it meets a familiar deductively valid pattern or not. And I know that a handful of you have already heard this song and dance before. Because if you've taken some other philosophy class such as ethics, we do some of this kind of analysis. You may have also seen it elsewhere. And I don't want this to scare anyone. You'll be responsible for this in a couple of weeks, not right now. This is sort of an overview. But if we were to write this argument in a sort of deductive structure, I'd be getting rid of this altogether. And I would write it like this. This is starting to look like what to some of you? Yeah, if you're a person who has math anxiety, this might be scaring you a little bit. Well, guess what? Don't let it scare you, because it doesn't get any more difficult than this, really. This statement reads, if it's the case that G, then it's the case that E. This sort of sideways horseshoe thing, and this is a term that you'll see in chapter 2, not in chapter 1, but I'm giving you this example now. This is a statement that we call this a conditional statement. Why? Well, because on condition that this is the case, then this will also be the case. In everyday life, we call these if-then statements. If G, then E. Now, my second premise said, but not E. But we can't have an economic downturn. You won't see this symbol in the textbook, but this is this tilde symbol that's on your keyboard. This stands in. for the word not, or it is not the case. Now, the conclusion that I had in my argument was, therefore, O, therefore not G. I probably don't have time to give you a full-blown explanation of this now. But when we do more work with deductive reasoning, I will explain to you, A, that this is a deductively valid structure. It is a deductively valid structure called modus tollens. Some of the language of philosophy, particularly in propositional logic, comes from Latin roots. So if it seems like a strange phrase, well, that's because it has Latin origins. This won't be on the test, but historically speaking, the language of European scholarship from the medieval world up through the 19th century was Latin. So we shouldn't be surprised why a lot of this terminology, comes out of Latin. Now, modus tollens really just means, translated into plain English, it means to deny the consequent. Consequent, what's that? Well, I'll go over this again. This tail end of this conditional statement we call the consequent. So what we did here was we denied the consequent. This side right here is called the antecedent. I will go over this again, don't worry. This is called the antecedent. This is a deductively valid structure. We will be looking at other examples of valid structures. Now, let me give you a conclusion that you need to draw about validity. Validity is merely a structural thing. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the truth value of the premises. The truth value of the premises are to be looked at independently. Can I erase this? I want to put something on the board that I hope you will have in your databanks. You will particularly want to have it in your databanks over the next couple of weeks when we're looking at more of this deduction type stuff. If you have a deductive argument, if a deductive argument is valid and its premises are true, then the conclusion follows by logical necessity. If you know you've got a deductive argument that is valid, and you know that its premises are true, then the conclusion will follow by logical necessity. So let me get this straight, or let me reiterate this. If I know my argument is deductive, and I want to determine if it is cogent or not, it has to meet these two criteria. It's got to meet the structure test. It's got to be valid. And it's got to have true premises. Now, this is a retread of what we talked about last time. Please, please, please get this concept of validity down. Resist the urge to let bad habits that you were taught, and like I said in the last lecture, it is not my students' fault that they were taught a misuse of the word valid. I'll repeat it. I have heard many people say, well, I think that's a valid statement. My snide little remark to that is, statements are not valid or invalid. Statements are true, false, or undetermined. In other words, we don't know if they're true or false. Arguments are valid or invalid. The truth value of the premises is a separate issue from validity. But I understand why students get it wrong. It is because of that colloquial usage of the word valid and true synonymously, even though they don't mean the same thing. Now, folks, we're going to pick up next time talking more about the criteria met by an argument, more on deduction and induction, as well as the rest of the chapter. Cheers for now.